Okay guys, so today we want to talk about why ERA is a poor metric. So unfortunately, the way that the game has kind of transpired, the first thing that many people look at is somebody's ERA. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell the whole picture about how a pitcher is performing, and there are a lot of uncontrollables within ERA that shouldn't be a burden or viewed negatively upon how a guy is performing on the mound. So looking at some of the uncontrollables with ERA, the first point I wanted to make was the quality of contact against. Whether the ball is being hit 110 miles an hour or 5 miles an hour, ERA does not care. You see this if a pitcher is giving up really hard contact outs. You're talking line drives right at outfielders, balls caught on the warning track into the wind. And on the inverse side, you see plenty of balls that are hit slowly that can result in hits, whether that's a swinging bunt, maybe a blooper that trickles into the outfield. And that's unfortunate because ultimately the pitcher is doing his job to eliminate hard contact. But ERA, again, does not factor that in. Second thing would be defensive positioning. So ultimately, ERA comes down to a lot of how your defenders are performing. Again, whether that's shift data, maybe your third baseman has limited range, but again, those reflections upon how you're performing on the mound are not indicative of what you can actually control. The other thing would be the sequencing of events. So ERA by itself, if we were really going to value runs allowed, we would just use runs allowed as a singular metric. With the sequence of events, I'm talking about times where maybe you're in the game, you leave two guys on base with 2 outs, guy follows you behind, cashes all of your runs in, or in the inverse, maybe you're the guy that comes in and there's already been an error committed, but there's 2 outs. So now if you were to walk 2, 3, 4 guys, give up a couple hits, maybe a homer, you're looking up and you had a terrible performance, but your ERA ultimately isn't going to sacrifice because of it. Again, going back to sample size, with limited sample, ERA really inflates heavily. And with that inflation, oftentimes it can take a pitcher a really long time to get that back on track. For instance, if you give up 6 runs in 1 inning pitched, it's going to take you 17 scoreless innings to even get that ERA back down to a 3. Also, earned runs factor in errors heavily. Errors are determined by the scorekeeper, which ultimately it's a judgment call. So again, there are other things that we like to look at more so, some of the controllables that you have on the mound, and we're going to go through some of those. So what metrics would be better at evaluating performance? So immediately, some of the ones that come to mind, especially for professional players, would be FIP and XFIP. Those are fielder independent pitching variables. So we're looking at an emphasis of how many home runs have you given up, aka what quality of contact, what is your strikeout rate, your walk rate, how many innings have you pitched, how many batters have you hit, how many runners have you left on base. So we're really standardizing a lot of those variables that we know come to a median range over a large sample. Also, some of the direct controllables that we like to look at would be K percentage and walk percentage. And the reason why we love looking at percentages over per 9 ratings is because per 9 numbers can become very skewed. For instance, if somebody thinks they had a really good outing because they struck out 3 guys, their K per 9 is now at 27. Ultimately, you look up, and if that guy had to face 10 batters to get through the inning per se, ultimately it wasn't a successful outing. However, if you were looking more so at percentages, that's going to be a better indicator of performance. So when looking at the importance of expected numbers, and again, pitchers having control over the things that they can control, a good example of that would be Colin Poche. So when we're going through Colin Poche's numbers, you can see his ERA for each respective season. You see in rookie ball, he has a 3.1, he has a 1 ERA, he has a 0 ERA at a couple stops, he has a 1 ERA in 2018 in AAA, and then when he actually gets called up, he has a 6.26 ERA. So to many people, that might be eye-opening. Why would this guy get called up with the highest ERA that he's ever had? So if we look a little bit further at that, we can see here with his K percentages and walk percentages, those numbers were nearly identical to what he had been every year previously. Again, K percentage, walk percentage being really strong indicators of success. We can also see that his batting average on balls in play was higher than it had ever been. At 459, you can consider a lot of that an unlucky trend. Also, we're only going off of 25 innings, which is a limited sample. Looking at left on base percentage, he was not leaving many guys on base. The home run rate was high. And like we mentioned before, xFIP being an important metric, xFIP normalizes for that home run rate. So if Poche is throwing in a small stadium, ultimately we're going to stabilize those numbers to about how many home runs he should be giving up. When looking at this, you see that this is a guy who is really performing well. Again, usually his FIP and expected numbers were matching up with ERA. However, the one season that ERA was not going great for him, you can still see that his expected numbers are really, really good, which explains why he's been so successful in the big leagues thus far. With ERA, there's a ton of luck or bad luck involved in what can move those numbers. Looking at that, you see if you have really good fielders and maybe they're making exceptional plays behind you, maybe you have good shift data backing it, you'll see that a lot of balls that should be hits are becoming outs. We would consider that a lucky outcome. On the other side of that argument, if you have bad shift data, a ball finds a hole, maybe your fielders just simply aren't that good, then that's an unlucky nature. But again, ERA isn't factoring that in. When we look at Brandon Woodruff, for example, we're taking a 15-game rolling average from 2019 through 2021, looking at his ERA versus FIP. And the main point you're trying to see here is that his FIP really stabilizes along this line at about 3, whereas ERA is so sporadic in terms of how high or low it can go. So again, early on when his ERA is elevated, you can see that FIP is not moving that much. Just like when you're looking at 2021 and the ERA is super low, you can see that FIP is still slightly above that, stabilizing on that line. And that's why we hate to use ERA in small sample sizes, because that stability is simply not there like it is with FIP. So what should you be using? First being K percentage. Again, just looking at the amount of batters you're striking out in relation to the total number of batters faced. Walk percentage being a similar thing. Doing this will go much further than just tracking how many guys you're striking out or walking per 9. You can also look at the percentage of hits that you're giving up that are going for extra bases. Oftentimes that will tell you if you are giving up a lot of damage, and a scale to look at quality of contact against. Make sure you're looking at those variables to better dictate analysis of how you are performing on the mound. Thank you guys for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.